Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, launching into a very enjoyable conversation with my friend and colleague, Cherie Harder, who heads the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C., which assembles some of the more intelligent conversations in the nation's capital on issues of faith, culture, and politics. Their office is literally just around the corner from the IRD, so I think of them as neighbors, although at this point in time, we're more separated as we're all isolated in our homes in a situation. Hopefully that will conclude soon. But Cherie, it's great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Mark. Thanks for inviting me.
Cherie, of course, knows her own bio better than I do, but I do recall she had a distinguished career on Capitol Hill, working for a former Senate Majority Leader, and later worked for First Lady Laura Bush, among other accomplishments. And I believe she has been president of the Trinity Forum about as long as I've been president of the IRD, which is just over a decade. Is that accurate, Cherie?
Yeah, that's right. It was 12 years on St. Patty's Day.
Yes, and we both entered into situations where everything was easy and calm and stable, and there were no challenges at that time. So, but everything worked out well. Cherie, why don't you tell us a little bit about Trinity Forum, its background, and its purposes?
Oh, gladly. Thanks for asking, Mark. So Trinity Forum was established over 25 years ago by Os Guinness, who some of your viewers may be familiar with, along with Al McDonald. And really the original and founding mission and purpose was to serve sort of like an Aspen Institute, but with a Christian worldview, a place to provide a platform for the best of Christian thought leadership, and where leading thinkers could connect with thinking leaders in engaging the big questions of life in the context of faith. And there was the hope of providing a place where leaders could kind of wrestle together with what matters most, using the best resources that history provides, not only the Bible, but also great books to engage with some of the great wisdom of the humanities. And part of our hope is to continue that mission, to provide a platform for the best of Christian thought leadership, to cultivate, curate, and disseminate it, and to start conversations that matter. And so we try to do that through not only publishing readings, where we take the best of literature and letters and try to make it more accessible for busy professionals, but also through Socratic forums and what we call evening conversations, which are lecture and discussion series to enable people to kind of grapple with those big questions. And we're big believers in embodied, incarnational interaction. So of course we've had to take some basically experimental routes since the pandemic. So we're moving some of our programs online and doing online conversations, trying to feature the best of Christian thought.
Now, typically you all host outstanding gatherings at the National Press Club, often including hundreds of people in your audience with speakers
like you.
Well, no, wow, we can't afford the National Press Club typically. So I much enjoy your events, and speakers like Ross Douthat, David Brooks, members of Congress, many other notable. So how are you continuing with Trinity's Forum these days and the online universe?
That's right. Well, obviously we can't meet in person now since we all have to socially distance. So that's kind of been cramping our style in terms of gathering large groups of folks together. So what we've been trying to do is to make some of those conversations and discussions available online. And some of this has been experimental, but every week now, or at least once a week on a Friday, we host a Christian thought leader and engage some topics. So this last Friday, it was our mutual friend, Joe LeConte, who has a documentary coming out based on his book, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, which basically looked at the friendship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and how those two men's vocation, moral and spiritual imagination were really shaped both by their friendship and by the experience that they had really on the front lines of World War I. And so talked with Joe about what we can learn from their example in our own time, about friendship, about hardship, about resilience, about how, in essence, suffering and hardship can actually ignite one's imagination and the role that relationships play in that. The week before that, we got to talk with Karen Swallow Prior, who's written a couple of different books, including Booked Literature in the Heart of Me and a book on the great books. And we talked with her about reading in quarantine. And kind of, in many ways, this is an opportunity for at least some of us to have some time, since we're cooped up at home, to actually do more deep reading. And as Christians, we are people of the book. We worship the word. Scripture is meant to be read. There are habits of reading that can be cultivated that have implications for deeper spiritual understanding. And so talked with Karen about what some of those are, how we can learn to read more wisely and well. And perhaps, obviously there's a lot of people who are suffering very acutely, but many of us have perhaps a little bit more time at home than we had previously. And one of the, we can call them even an unexpected gift of this rather surreal time is time to read. And so try to use that opportunity to basically encourage and even inspire some of our viewers and listeners to pick up a book worth reading and engage with it. Week before, we talked with Kurt Thompson, who is a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist, about shame and redeeming shame, what shame does to us, what the Bible has to say about shame, and how that affects our, well, in some ways, our spiritual lives, our understanding of sin and redemption. So we've been taking different discussions like this and essentially putting them online. It's not the same as in person. We really miss the in-person interaction, but it's also been sort of a really interesting way to engage with friends and associates when we can't do it face-to-face.
And those listening in have been very large numbers, I understand, sometimes in the thousands. Is that right?
We've been really encouraged by the response and reaction to it. We didn't necessarily anticipate that well over 1,000 people would want to tune in on Good Friday to hear about shame, but it actually really seemed to touch a chord, in that it's something that I think everyone has dealt with. People raising children, that's certainly an issue. And of course, we worship a God who came to take away sins and to bring about reconciliation. And so it's sort of fascinating to see, the ways that neuroscience and psychiatry, some of the insights they give us on kind of what's happening as part of that process, just the way our minds work, what happens to our brain when we do have reconciliation and rupture is repaired. And it's been fascinating. So it's been fun to do that and engage in those kind of talks.
Well, Cherie, you had the distinction of hosting perhaps the last public event in Washington, D.C. In March with Ross Douthat. It felt like the ball the Duke of the Wellington had right before the Battle of Waterloo.
I think that's the first time anyone has said that to me, but thanks, Mark. Yes.
It'll be unforgettable for all of us who were there. When I look at the people who attend your events, they tend to be very intellectual, very well-educated, intense Washingtonians who are very focused on issues, and what you provide really feeds their spiritual and intellectual needs. How do you reach these intense Washingtonians at the same time as reaching others outside the Washington bubble? And then upon reflection, how do you compare how these DC Christians today, what their interests are and what their focus areas are compared to when you first came to Washington years ago?
Oh gosh, that's a fascinating question, Mark. I don't know that I have a ready answer for it, but I guess a few thoughts. One, I do see some pretty significant generational divides. And of course, I'm generalizing here among Christians, and that among sort of a younger generation, and again, trafficking generalities here, I do see more interest in, or I should say less interest in the culture wars and more interest in what one of our senior fellows, Mako Fujimura, called culture care. He really described culture as a garden to be cultivated rather than a battlefield to be seized. And so if you're interested in culture care, not only do you use different metaphors, but there's often different topics that are of real interest. You may be more interested in beauty, in the humanities, in the arts, in literature and poetry, in essentially the expressions of the beauty of our God and how they can play out in the human realm, which are a different set of concerns than the more politically oriented, sometimes fear-based, certainly not always, but sometimes fear-based concerns about losing cultural or political ground. So, I think, both are of interest to our viewers and the people who come. It's really kind of it's a broad audience. There are certainly some intense types and there are certainly some policy wonks. One of the things we've been really thrilled about is that if you go to a typical Trinity Forum event, you really will see people from 22 to 85 or so. It's a broad range, and we're really thrilled about that. So we try to consistently offer up some of the wisest, what we think are some of the wisest Christian thought leaders and ideas, and hope it will attract a wide variety of people, and are just really pleased by whoever comes.
I hope I don't get too personal for you, Cherie, but I know you go to, brace yourself. I know you go to a prominent Anglican church in Northern Virginia. That's not your background. And it seems like a lot of people active in the Trinity Forum seem to come from Anglican or more liturgical backgrounds. And I'm about to make perhaps an unfair generalization, but it seems like the liturgical Christians often have a better appreciation for issues relating to culture and literature, beauty, the aesthetic. Do you think that might be true?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I'd want to think about that more, but that does resonate with me rather intuitively. I did grow up sort of Southern Baptist, I've had a background of more fundamentalist Baptist. I don't know, again, speaking in generalities, that the fundies are known for their love of beauty, or their kind of aesthetic sense.
For them, it's love of the word more is the focus.
Yeah, that's right. And there's often an emphasis, on the preacher, the actual delivery of the word. They're usually the focus of the sermon. A liturgical tradition, there is an emphasis on beauty. There's an emphasis on kind of on timing and the seasonality and fullness of time, and kind of the flowering and repetition of the liturgical year. So there are seasons and cycles and rituals, and more of an emphasis on, I think, what liturgy is, the embodied practice that helps form not only our love, sort of what we prioritize, but also what we attract to, what we consider beautiful. And that I do think is more intentional and sort of baked into a liturgical expression of worship than it is with some others.
Well, finally, Cherie, let me ask you, you're very plugged into the Christian thought world in DC and across the country, or at least you know people who are. So if you had to assess or offer some names of people who are up-and-coming voices, up-and-coming Christian thought leaders, any names you could share with us whom we should be looking for now or in the future?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. Our mutual friend Joe LaConte, I think, is always well worth listening to. I am a big fan of Kurt Thompson. I think he's a voice we'll be hearing from more and more in the future. Karen Swallow Prior, who I mentioned earlier, I would highly recommend her books. James K.A. Smith at Calvin College, who is the new editor-in-chief of Image Journal, I think is a wise man and really love reading what he's written. Our mutual friend Ann Snyder, who's now the editor-in-chief of Comment, I would definitely include in that mix. Mako Fujimura, who I mentioned earlier, is, I think there's just real wisdom and beauty in many of his thoughts and ideas. I'm going to have the pleasure of talking on Friday with Dana Gioia, who is the Poet Laureate of California, former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, who's a poet, obviously, and a very accessible poet whose poetry is beautiful. It's very easy to appreciate. There's rhyme, there's meter, there's loveliness. It's not overly academic. And there's a great thoughtfulness behind the poetry. One of the things I really appreciate about both Dana and Mako, a lot of times I think some artists find it hard to articulate some of the thinking or the ideas behind their art. Both of them are very skilled and talented at that. So it's easier perhaps to understand if you're not already an artist, kind of what's going into that. There are, gosh, there's so many others. Michael Ware is someone I would recommend. Justin Giboney, talked just last night with Tim Dalrymple, who's the new editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. And I think there's a wisdom far beyond his years there. Matthew Lee Anderson at Baylor is someone who also founded the Mere Orthodoxy blog, is someone whose takes I think are quite insightful. There are so many, and I think it's really quite exciting how many really thoughtful, up and coming Christians there are who are writing, who are creating, who are using different media and storytelling media and others to kind of express their faith.
So it sounds like you are enthusiastically hopeful about the future of American Christian thought, given the list of names you just shared.
Well, there's always reasons to feel discouraged, but I think there's reasons for great hope too. And of course, the ultimate reason is, what we celebrated just a couple of weeks ago. Love has won and he lives.
Well, on that appropriate note, Cherie, thank you. A highly productive and enjoyable conversation as fully anticipated, and hopefully I'll be seeing you in the flesh downtown DC at some point in the near future.
Always fun to chat with you, Mark.
Thanks, Cherie.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Bye.